Mrs. Karen Whitman, a stern, middle-aged woman with sharp features and cold, piercing eyes, had been a teacher at Oak Ridge High for nearly 15 years. She had a reputation for being strict, unforgiving, and, in certain circles, particularly biased against students of color. To most of her colleagues and the parents who never looked closely enough, she was simply old-fashioned or traditional. But to many students, especially those who weren't white, Mrs. Whitman was something else entirely. A racist bully in a position of power. Oak Ridge High was known for its diversity, as it sat in the middle of a bustling city, where people of all races and backgrounds coexisted. But the school's reputation didn't reflect the silent struggles of many of its students, particularly the black and brown kids who often felt Mrs. Whitman's harsh hand of discipline for the most minor infractions. Jasmine Brooks, a soft-spoken black girl in Mrs. Whitman's third-period history class, had always been a quiet student. She excelled in her work, kept to herself, and never caused trouble. But to Mrs. Whitman, none of that mattered. From the very first day Jasmine walked into her classroom, Mrs. Whitman had made her a target. It started with subtle remarks, little comments that no one could quite pin down as overtly racist, but had a clear undertone of disdain. "Jasmine, can you try to speak a little more clearly? We need to understand what you're saying. Why do you always seem so distracted? Pay attention like the others, please." It escalated quickly. Mrs. Whitman began calling on Jasmine for every difficult question, knowing full well that she wouldn't always have the answer. And when Jasmine didn't know, the teacher would sigh dramatically, making a point to look at the rest of the class as if to say, "See what I have to deal with." The other students watched. Some whispered behind Jasmine's back, others just tried to avoid her, fearing that they too would become a target if they associated with her too much. But Jasmine, with her quiet strength, refused to break. One Wednesday afternoon, Jasmine raised her hand to ask a question about the Civil War. Mrs. Whitman, who had been writing on the board, turned around slowly and glared. "What is it now, Jasmine? I'm sure whatever question you have could be answered if you were paying attention like the rest of the class." Jasmine felt a hot flush creep up her neck, but she stood her ground. "I just wanted to ask if you could explain why the North's strategy shifted in 1863. The room went silent. Mrs. Whitman smirked. "Oh, I see," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You're trying to sound smart today, aren't you? Maybe if you spent more time studying instead of, well, whatever it is you people do, you wouldn't need to ask such basic questions." There it was. The whole class felt it. Those words, "you people." A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one said a word. Mrs. Whitman turned back to the board, dismissing Jasmine as if she were invisible. Jasmine stared at her desk, her hands trembling with a mix of rage and humiliation. For the next few weeks, things only got worse. Mrs. Whitman continued her campaign of harassment, escalating to the point where she would single out Jasmine almost every day. Whether it was criticizing her handwriting, questioning her intelligence, or implying that she wasn't trying hard enough, the attacks were constant. What Mrs. Whitman didn't know, however, was that Jasmine wasn't just any student. She was the daughter of Dr. Renee Brooks, the school's principal. Dr. Brooks had worked hard to earn her position at Oak Ridge, breaking barriers as one of the first black women to hold such a role in the district. She had kept her personal life private, not wanting Jasmine to be treated any differently because of her position, and she trusted that the teachers would treat her daughter with fairness and respect. But Jasmine, not wanting to seem weak or incapable, hadn't told her mother what was happening in Mrs. Whitman's classroom. That changed one day when Jasmine came home unusually quiet. Dr. Brooks, sensing something was off, sat down with her daughter. "Jazz, what's going on?" her mother asked, concern etched in her face. "You've been quiet lately. Is everything okay at school?" Jasmine hesitated. But the weight of weeks of mistreatment finally broke her silence. She told her mother everything, every cruel comment, every subtle jab, and every open insult Mrs. Whitman had thrown her way. Dr. Brooks listened, her face unreadable. But inside, she was fuming. As a black woman who had faced her own battles against prejudice throughout her career, she knew too well the pain of racism. But to hear that her daughter was enduring this, under her own roof no less, was too much to bear. The next morning, Dr. Brooks arrived at school earlier than usual, her face set in a calm but determined expression. She had no intention of flying off the handle. No, this situation required something more powerful than anger. She would handle Mrs. Whitman with professionalism, but she would not let this go unchecked. Meanwhile, in third period, Mrs. Whitman walked into her classroom as usual. She scanned the room, her eyes narrowing when they landed on Jasmine. Today, Jasmine sat with her head high, her face calm and unbothered, as though she had already won a battle Mrs. Whitman wasn't aware of. "Well, well," Mrs. Whitman sneered. "I see you finally decided to—" Before she could finish, the classroom door opened, and in walked Dr. Brooks. The students gasped, not used to seeing the principal in the middle of class. Mrs. Whitman froze, her smirk quickly fading. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitman," Dr. Brooks said, her voice smooth and authoritative. "Could I have a word with you outside, please?" Mrs. Whitman blinked, clearly taken aback. "Oh, of course, Dr. Brooks. Just a moment, class." The two women stepped outside, and the classroom buzzed with whispers. Jasmine kept her gaze straight ahead, her heart pounding in her chest but her face revealing nothing. Outside, Dr. Brooks faced Mrs. Whitman with an icy calm. "I've been made aware of the way you've been treating my daughter," she began. "And not just her, but other students as well." Mrs. Whitman's face paled. "Your daughter?" "Yes, Jasmine Brooks is my daughter, and I've heard enough about your behavior to know that it stops today." That evening, as Jasmine sat in her room reflecting on everything that had happened, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in weeks. The constant knot of anxiety that had sat in her chest during Mrs. Whitman's class was gone. She knew she wasn't the only one who had suffered in silence, and the thought of other students being free from the teacher's prejudice filled her with pride. The next day at school, Jasmine noticed a difference in the atmosphere. Her classmates, some who had kept their distance during the weeks of Mrs. Whitman's torment, now approached her with quiet support. A few even offered words of encouragement. "Jasmine, I'm really sorry about what you went through," one of her classmates, Mia, said softly as they walked to their lockers. "I should have spoken up sooner." Jasmine smiled. "It's okay. We all just do our best to get through things. But thanks. It means a lot." As the days passed, the school began to shift in small but meaningful ways. Jasmine noticed that teachers, especially those who had stayed on the sidelines before, were more mindful of how they spoke to students. Conversations about race and fairness, once ignored or brushed aside, were now being held more openly, both in classrooms and among the students. The impact of Mrs. Whitman's removal seemed to ripple through the school, challenging old habits and opening new possibilities. Dr. Brooks also made sure to take further steps, not just as a mother, but as the principal of Oak Ridge. She organized diversity and inclusion workshops for the staff, and she began holding regular meetings with students, making sure they knew their voices mattered. She wanted to ensure that Oak Ridge was a place where everyone could feel safe, respected, and valued. For Jasmine, life slowly settled into a new rhythm. She thrived in her classes, no longer having to deal with Mrs. Whitman's subtle yet painful barbs. She found new friendships, some with classmates who had once stayed silent but were now more willing to stand together. One afternoon, as Jasmine walked through the school hallways, She passed a bulletin board covered with colorful notes from students thanking the staff for their efforts to make the school more inclusive. Among the notes, Jasmine spotted one that made her smile. "Thank you for listening. Thank you for making this school a place where I can be myself." A grateful student. She didn't know who wrote it, but the words resonated deeply with her. It wasn't just about her experience with Mrs. Whitman. It was about the change that could happen when people stood up for themselves and for others. Jasmine's quiet strength had sparked something bigger than she had ever imagined. And though the journey hadn't been easy, she was proud of the part she had played in making Oak Ridge a better place for everyone. As she walked past the board, feeling lighter than she had in a long time, Jasmine knew that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something better. And in her heart, she carried the knowledge that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she had the strength and the voice to face them head on. And so, life moved forward at Oak Ridge High. But it would never be the same. It was better, more just, more inclusive, and more aware of the quiet battles students like Jasmine fought every day. The school had learned, and Jasmine had triumphed. As the days turned into weeks, the changes at Oak Ridge High became more permanent. Dr. Brooks had instituted not just temporary workshops, but a long-term program focused on equity and inclusion, ensuring that the school would never again become a place where students could be singled out or belittled because of who they were. The students felt it in the way teachers interacted with them, the way discussions in classrooms were more open and understanding. Even those who had been hesitant to speak about race or injustice found that they could voice their opinions and concerns without fear. Jasmine became something of a quiet symbol in the school. Though she never sought attention or recognition, students knew what she had endured, and they saw how she had held herself with dignity throughout. Some even looked to her for guidance, asking her advice when they faced challenges with teachers or classmates. And Jasmine, always calm and thoughtful, offered support where she could, never claiming to be a leader but naturally becoming one. One afternoon, Dr. Brooks called Jasmine into her office. It was nothing formal, just a mother wanting to check in on her daughter after everything that had happened. The office was quiet, with a warm, welcoming air that contrasted the sterility of most school offices. Dr. Brooks smiled as Jasmine walked in, motioning for her to sit down. "How are you feeling, Jazz?" Dr. Brooks asked, her tone soft but concerned. "It's been a few weeks since everything with Mrs. Whitman. I just wanted to make sure you're okay." Jasmine sat down, looking around the familiar office that she had been in so many times before. She smiled faintly at her mother. "I'm good, Mom. It was hard at first, but things are a lot better now. I think people are starting to change. At least it feels that way." Dr. Brooks nodded, her eyes warm with pride. "You've been really strong through all of this. You did something not a lot of people would have the courage to do. And because of you, this school is different now. Better." Jasmine shrugged modestly. "I didn't do that much. I just told you what was happening." Dr. Brooks leaned forward, her expression serious. "It's more than that. You didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for everyone who's ever been treated unfairly. And people saw that. They saw how you handled everything, how you stayed calm and kept your dignity. That's powerful, Jasmine." Jasmine looked down at her hands, feeling a little embarrassed but also deeply touched by her mother's words. "I just didn't want anyone else to go through what I did," she said quietly. "No one should have to feel like that in school." Dr. Brooks nodded in agreement. "And because of you, they won't. Not here, not anymore." There was a moment of silence between them, filled with unspoken understanding and pride. Jasmine knew her mother was right, even if she hadn't realized it at the time. What she had done had made a difference, not just for herself, but for everyone at Oak Ridge. As she got up to leave, Dr. Brooks reached out and gently took her hand. "I'm proud of you, Jasmine, more than you'll ever know." Jasmine smiled at her mother, feeling a warmth inside that hadn't been there in a long time. "Thanks, Mom. I'm proud of you too." With that, Jasmine left the office, feeling lighter and more confident than ever before. She knew there would be other challenges in life, but after facing Mrs. Whitman and coming out stronger, she felt ready for anything. As the school year went on, Oak Ridge continued to grow and evolve. Mrs. Whitman's absence was barely noticed after a while, replaced by a new teacher who brought a sense of inclusivity and understanding to the classroom. Jasmine excelled in her studies, no longer weighed down by the anxiety and fear she had once felt in history class. The changes at the school extended beyond just policies and programs. The students themselves were more open, more willing to stand up for one another. Jasmine found herself surrounded by friends who admired her strength and resilience, and who shared her desire to create a more supportive, respectful environment. And though Jasmine never sought recognition for what she had done, the impact of her actions rippled through the halls of Oak Ridge High. Her quiet courage had sparked something lasting, something that would continue to shape the school for years to come. In the end, Jasmine realized that standing up for herself hadn't just changed the way people saw her, it had changed the way she saw herself. She had discovered a strength she didn't know she had, and with it, the knowledge that she could face any challenge life threw her way. And as she walked through the halls of Oak Ridge High, head held high and shoulders back, Jasmine knew that she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. Months passed, and the school year at Oak Ridge High progressed smoothly. Jasmine's life returned to normal, or at least a new kind of normal. She no longer had to navigate the tense and hostile environment that Mrs. Whitman had created. Instead, she found herself flourishing academically and personally. Her classmates were more open, and many of the quieter students had begun to find their voices. Jasmine, without even realizing it, had become a quiet leader among them. In class, teachers were more mindful of their interactions with students, ensuring that everyone felt included. The administration continued its commitment to fostering a culture of respect and fairness, with Dr. Brooks leading the charge. She had formed student advisory groups, allowing students like Jasmine to have a say in the policies and decisions that affected their school lives. One day, Jasmine was called to the stage at a school assembly. Dr. Brooks had organized it to celebrate the strides Oak Ridge had made toward becoming a more inclusive school. As Jasmine stood at the podium, the auditorium filled with students who had once watched in silence as she endured Mrs. Whitman's cruel behavior. Now, they looked up at her with admiration and respect. Dr. Brooks stood beside her, beaming with pride as she introduced Jasmine. "Today, we celebrate progress, change, and the power of standing up for what is right," Dr. Brooks began, her voice carrying through the auditorium. Jasmine Brooks didn't ask to be a leader, but she became one through her courage and quiet strength. Because of her, Oak Ridge is a better place for all of us. The crowd erupted into applause, and for a moment, Jasmine felt overwhelmed. She had never expected this kind of recognition. She had only wanted fairness, not just for herself, but for everyone. Yet here she was, standing in front of her peers, not because of the pain she had endured, but because of the change she had inspired. When the applause died down, Jasmine spoke into the microphone, her voice steady but humble. "I didn't think I'd ever be standing here," she began. "I just wanted things to be fair. I wanted to feel like I belonged, like everyone else. But what I've learned is that when you stand up for yourself, you stand up for others too. And sometimes, that's all it takes to make things better." She paused, gathering her thoughts. Oak Ridge is changing, and I'm proud of that. I'm proud of all of us for speaking up, for being open, and for making sure that this school is a place where everyone can feel safe and respected. We still have a lot of work to do, but we're doing it together." Another wave of applause followed as Jasmine stepped back from the podium, her heart full of pride and gratitude. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the community she had helped to shape and the future they were all working toward. After the assembly, students and teachers approached Jasmine, offering words of thanks and encouragement. Even those who had once stayed silent now expressed their admiration for her bravery. It was a turning point, not just for Jasmine, but for Oak Ridge as a whole. As the school year drew to a close, Jasmine reflected on how much had changed. She had faced a challenge she never expected, but in doing so, she had found her voice and discovered a strength she didn't know she had. She knew there would be more challenges ahead, college, adulthood, the broader world, but she was ready for them. With her head held high and her heart full, Jasmine walked the halls of Oak Ridge one last time before graduation, knowing that she had left her mark not just on the school, but on the people within it. Her story wasn't just about overcoming adversity. It was about changing the world around her, one step at a time. And with that, Jasmine stepped confidently into her future, knowing that she could face anything with the same quiet strength that had carried her through her journey at Oak Ridge High. As graduation approached, Jasmine felt a bittersweet mix of emotions. The journey she had gone through at Oak Ridge High was full of trials, but also of growth, change, and triumph. The day of the graduation ceremony finally arrived, and Jasmine found herself sitting among her classmates in her cap and gown, the future ahead of them bright and open. The ceremony was filled with speeches from school officials, teachers, and selected students. Jasmine listened, reflecting on how far she had come. She wasn't one of the chosen speakers this time, but that didn't bother her. She was content to sit quietly, knowing she had already said and done more than she ever thought she could. At one point, Dr. Brooks took to the stage, addressing the graduating class. Her eyes scanned the crowd, and for a brief moment, they met Jasmine's. A knowing smile passed between them. "As you all leave Oak Ridge and go on to new adventures," Dr. Brooks said, her voice strong, "remember that each of you has the power to make a difference, no matter how quiet or how small your actions may seem. You've shown us this year that standing up for yourself and for others can lead to lasting change." Jasmine felt her heart swell with pride. She knew her mother wasn't just speaking in generalities. She was speaking to her, to all the students who had played a role in changing the culture at Oak Ridge. And it wasn't just about Mrs. Whitman's removal. It was about the ripple effect that had spread through the school since then. The way students had begun to look out for each other, to speak up when something was wrong, to make sure everyone felt included. As the ceremony drew to a close, and each student's name was called to receive their diploma, Jasmine felt a sense of fulfillment wash over her. When her name was announced, Jasmine Brooks, the cheers from her classmates were loud, louder than she expected. As she walked across the stage, shaking hands with the principal, who happened to be her mother, Jasmine grinned. It was a moment that felt not just like the end of something, but the beginning of everything else. After the ceremony, Jasmine's friends and family gathered around her, offering congratulations. Her mother hugged her tightly, whispering in her ear, "You've made me so proud, Jasmine. I can't wait to see what you do next." Jasmine smiled, feeling that deep sense of connection to the woman who had not only been her mother, but also her greatest advocate and inspiration. "Thanks, Mom. I couldn't have done any of this without you." As the evening continued and the crowd began to disperse, Jasmine took one last walk through the now empty halls of Oak Ridge High. She passed by the classroom where Mrs. Whitman had once taught, where everything had started. But instead of feeling bitterness or anger, Jasmine felt at peace. That chapter of her life had closed, and she had come out of it stronger, wiser, and more confident in herself. As she reached the doors to leave Oak Ridge for the final time, Jasmine paused for a moment. She took a deep breath and stepped outside, feeling the warmth of the summer evening. The world beyond those doors was vast and unknown, but for the first time, Jasmine felt ready for whatever came next. With her diploma in hand and her heart full of hope, Jasmine walked into the next chapter of her life. The quiet girl who had once been bullied had grown into a strong, resilient young woman, and she knew that wherever her path took her, she would continue to stand up for herself and others, just as she had at Oak Ridge. And with that, her story at Oak Ridge High came to an end. But Jasmine's journey was only just beginning. The lessons she had learned, the strength she had found, and the change she had inspired would stay with her, guiding her forward into a future she was ready to embrace. As Jasmine stepped outside into the cool evening air, she felt the weight of the past few years finally lift from her shoulders. The sky above was painted in soft hues of orange and pink as the sun set on her time at Oak Ridge High. But instead of feeling apprehensive about the future, she felt a calm certainty. Everything she had been through, from the quiet battles in Mrs. Whitman's classroom to the moments of triumph, had shaped her into the person she was now, strong, resilient, and unafraid to stand up for what was right. Her family gathered around her in the parking lot, her friends laughing and chatting nearby, and Jasmine couldn't help but smile. She looked over at her mother, Dr. Brooks, who was deep in conversation with a few of the teachers. Her mom had been her rock, not just in school, but throughout her life. Jasmine walked over to her, waiting for a pause in the conversation before gently tapping her mother's shoulder. Dr. Brooks turned, her face lighting up when she saw Jasmine. "Hey, graduate," she said warmly, wrapping her arm around Jasmine's shoulders. "How are you feeling?" Jasmine hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "I feel good. Really good, actually. It's strange, you know. I thought I'd feel nervous about what comes next, but I'm ready." Dr. Brooks nodded, her eyes shining with pride. "You've come a long way, Jasmine. You've been through more than most people your age, but you handled everything with grace and strength. Whatever comes next, I know you'll be ready for it." They stood there for a moment, looking out over the parking lot as families and friends slowly made their way home. The day had been long, but the air was filled with a quiet sense of celebration, of closure and new beginnings. "Have you thought about college?" Dr. Brooks asked, glancing sideways at Jasmine. Jasmine nodded. "Yeah, I've been thinking about it a lot. I'm excited to go, but I think more than that, I'm excited to see what else I can do. I want to keep helping people, like we did here at Oak Ridge. Maybe not in the same way, but something like it." Her mother smiled, squeezing her shoulder. "You've got a good heart, Jasmine. Whatever you choose to do, just remember to always stay true to that." Jasmine nodded, feeling the truth of those words sink in. She had found her voice, not just in that classroom, but in life. And she wasn't about to let it fade. She had discovered that standing up for herself meant standing up for others too, and that was a lesson she intended to carry forward wherever she went. The drive home that evening was filled with quiet conversations and laughter. Her family reminisced about the past few years, but Jasmine's mind was already on the future. She thought about the college campus she would soon step foot on, the people she would meet, and the experiences she would have. It wasn't just about academics anymore. It was about making an impact, just as she had done at Oak Ridge. As they pulled into the driveway, the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. Jasmine looked out the window, her heart full of anticipation. She knew that the next chapter of her life was about to begin, and she was ready to embrace it fully. That night, as she lay in bed, Jasmine reflected on her journey, the challenges she had faced, the victories she had won, and the lessons she had learned had all shaped her into who she was. She wasn't the quiet girl who had once hesitated to speak up. She was Jasmine Brooks, strong, confident, and ready to take on whatever the world threw at her. And so, with a sense of peace and purpose, Jasmine closed her eyes, knowing that this wasn't the end of her story. It was only the beginning. Whatever came next, she was ready for it, and she knew that she would face it with the same courage and determination that had carried her through Oak Ridge High. The world was wide open, and Jasmine was prepared to make her mark. In the quiet of that night, Jasmine's future felt limitless, and for the first time in a long while, she drifted to sleep with a smile on her face, knowing that she was exactly where she needed to be. As Jasmine drifted off to sleep, she thought about the journey she'd been on, how she had once felt powerless, silenced by Mrs. Whitman's prejudice and the fear of standing out. But in facing that challenge, she had learned one of the most important lessons of her life. Strength isn't always loud, and courage isn't about being fearless. It's about standing up when it matters most, even when you're afraid. The lesson she carried from her time at Oak Ridge wasn't just about standing up for herself. It was about knowing that change begins with one voice, no matter how small. By speaking up, she had shown her classmates, her teachers, and even herself that one person's actions could inspire others to join in, to demand fairness, respect, and dignity. Jasmine had learned that real power comes from within, from having the courage to demand better, not just for yourself, but for everyone around you. The ripple effect of that courage could transform not just a classroom, but a school, a community, or even the world. And Jasmine knew that wherever life took her next, she would carry that lesson with her. The great lesson was this: change begins with the courage to stand, and in standing for what's right, we give others the courage to do the same. With that truth in her heart, Jasmine was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that as long as she stayed true to herself, she could handle anything.